The title, Anatomy of a Higher Education Teacher and Active Learning Methods. Why such a long title? We wanted really to connect these two concepts, so higher education teacher role and active learning methods, and we hope to be able to convince you that they really are two concepts which go very well together. How we have divided our talk. We're going to start by talking briefly about teacher identity. This will lead us to the question of student-centered and teacher-centered teaching. We're then going to stop at active learning methods, what do we understand by this, and what exactly do we mean when we talk about active learning. And Anja will then focus on the importance of asking the right questions, and we will also see how this is connected with active learning. So briefly, this is how we are going to go through this talk today. And as I said, we're going to start with university teacher identity. Teacher identity in general, but especially university teacher identity. This is what we are here for. In fact, an important question which I believe every university teacher has to answer at some point is how we see ourselves as university teachers. What do we see when we look at ourselves? But even more importantly, how and who we would like to become. So it's always a question of how do I see myself now, but who do I want to be and how do I want to evolve? And this is what we are talking about when we're talking about teacher identity. And I think we all agree that teacher identity is a very complex construct. I mean, identity in general is a complex construct, but teacher identity, of course, as well. Okay. And if we just look at, let's say, a kind of a definition, just to understand what we're talking about, what is identity? One of the definitions, of course. Holland and Lepicott say that identity is that self-understanding to which one is emotionally attached and that informs one's behavior and interpretations. So it's an emotional thing too. It's not just an understanding of how we behave and how we interpret what we do, but also very, very emotional. We are attached to this idea of who we are, let's say. Maybe we can say that identity makes us who we are. And this also goes, of course, for teacher identity. Now, an important element of the universal teacher identity is the fact that since we have to do both teaching and research, we need to constantly negotiate these two roles, the role of a teacher and the role of the researcher. So this is what is typical for a university teacher and not, for example, for a high school teacher. We can say that there is an identity tension between these two roles. And of course, we all have integrated identities. We all are different things. We are teachers, mothers, friends, and so on and so on. But speaking of the university teacher, there is this tension between these two roles. And some of us see ourselves primarily as researchers, perhaps, who also teach, while others we see ourselves maybe as teachers who also do research. And maybe there's a group, many of us, who come somewhere between these two extremes. So a little bit of one on end or the other. And this is a very important distinction, I think, because it determines how we will act in the classroom. Maybe even more importantly, what kind of relationship we will have with the students. Of course, I remember last year when we had a similar presentation, one of the participants said, yes, but when I'm teaching, it's also very important for me to be a researcher as well. Of course, yes, because being a teacher and a researcher is an advantage in the sense that you can use the strategies you develop as a researcher also in teaching. That's true. But it's also very important that when you are in the lecture hall, when you are in the classroom, you are a teacher, not a researcher. Now, why is this so important? Let's say. Why is it so important to understand our role as a university teacher? I think the answer to this is that the perception of our role as a teacher influences, has a really important impact on the teaching strategies and the methods which you will use in teaching in the classroom. And as I said also earlier, especially on this role between teacher and student. Now, so we have to negotiate this role all the time. Now, who am I and who do I want to become? This is what we're going to try and find out now. Interesting, there is one way, one tool which we can use to get an idea of who we are as university teachers. And I would like today to propose this tool, and it's a tool which has been used also in many other contexts, in research contexts, in teaching contexts. In fact, something very simple I would like to propose using metaphors. Metaphors as reflective tools. Tools which help us get a kind of insight, understand the link between what we think, so our thoughts, and the language we use. So a link between language and thought. And of course, we are not the first ones to be doing this. Many other disciplines have already used metaphors for these purposes. Just to maybe make sure we are not talking here about original, innovative metaphors, literary metaphors. We are talking about everyday concepts, concepts which help us understand our reality and our role in it. So very, very basic primary metaphors. As they are seen here as a tool, as a tool especially, very important. And perhaps it's important to say that the metaphors also highlight the role of us, of the teachers, as reflective practitioners. So we are reflective practitioners. Why is it important to see ourselves as reflective practitioners? Because this idea of reflective practitioner gives us the message that we should always constantly evaluate our beliefs, our assumptions, and think about the role we are playing and we are supposed to play as university teachers. Yeah, again, why is it so important to talk about this? Isn't this obvious, maybe self-evident? Why do we have to constantly think about our role as teachers? I think the most important reason for this is that, especially when we look at the research into teachers' thought processes, we talk about teachers' cognition. We can see that there is a link between what teachers think, know, and believe, and what you do in your teaching. So there is this link, and that's why it's really important to look at the cognition. So here's let's say, our main question. Okay, so who am I? Again, I'm asking this question again and again. So who am I? Yeah, we all have different preconceptions about who we are when we are in the classroom. Here are some ideas, perhaps, from different times. But who am I? And in fact, before we go on, I could give you a personal example, because I think it's always a good idea when we share, then we can recognize the way we think, and in this sharing, we can also come to some conclusions about the role and see the role more clearly. When I started teaching almost 30 years ago, I have to say that I saw myself quite clearly as a book, or even better, as an encyclopedia. It was very important for me to know as much as possible. So every detail, I was really afraid students would ask me something I wouldn't know. This was a huge fear at the beginning. So what I did, I spent hours working on collecting, gathering knowledge. Also, when I prepared for my lessons, I did focus, of course, all on the activity, but content was very important for me. But I didn't think about how the students would absorb, let's say, this content, how they will learn. I focused mostly on the activities, on the content. I never thought about, at least at the beginning not, but I did later on, think about working on how much they already know. So really focusing on how much they already know. And I thought that if I knew my discipline well, I would be able to then pass it on to my students. Now, of course, today quickly I realized this was not the best strategy. And today, and I think some of you also already mentioned also this metaphor, I prefer and I see myself more as a gardener. Yeah, you mentioned the metaphor of gardener, a very famous metaphor also in teaching. Now, why? If we go into this idea of a garden, why? Because now I see that the learning is much more effective if I see myself as somebody who, I can use this again, metaphor, who nurtures, yeah, and who assists the growth of students, like a gardener nurtures a plant. I see that it's much more important to use methods and materials to assist students in their learning, again, like the gardener who uses tools and compost to make sure the plants grow well. And again, like a gardener who makes sure that the environment for the plant is the right one, so it can develop to its fullest potential, we can say. I also make sure that the learning space allows students to develop. So not just my relationship with them, but also the learning space. And of course, the teacher as a gardener metaphor works for me today. But of course, there are other metaphors I use. What is important at this point is that by using the metaphor, you can explain your role. Yeah? So the metaphor here is used as a reflective tool to explain what we do. So what we do, we engage in this reflective process. And in this reflective process, we get a better understanding of our role as a teacher. So what am I doing with my students? Is this consistent with the metaphor, which I have chosen for myself? And this is why in this context, using the metaphor as a reflective tool helps me understand my role. So there are no good or bad metaphors. They're not better or worse metaphors, but this is just a tool which helps me understand if it is consistent, this image, with what I actually do in the classroom. So we can also, of course, talk about the university teacher anatomy, another metaphor. See, I keep using metaphors all the time. So here we have two metaphors, two extremes, as you wish. The teacher as an encyclopedia or a book, and the teacher as a gardener. And they, of course, reflect two different ways of understanding the role of the teacher. And we can say in the past, the teacher was conceived primarily as a transmitter of knowledge. So somebody who transmits or transfers knowledge. Today, which is also clear from your metaphors, we see ourselves more as mentors, guides. And of course, the expression facilitator is very, very famous today. So we see ourselves as facilitators. So, university teacher as mentor, facilitator, guide. Okay, so the question is, what roles should we play as teachers? What is our anatomy? What should the anatomy of a university teacher be? If we go back again into these two metaphors, these two paradigms, especially in the last few decades, we could say to have witnessed a kind of paradigmatic shift at all levels of education, also in higher education. So it's a shift from teaching to learning, from the concept of teaching as transfer of knowledge to the concept of teaching and learning as active construction of knowledge. And here there's a very strong focus on student activity. Now, in knowledge transfer, the emphasis is on how to transfer knowledge, of course. Yeah? So how to package it, if you wish. And as I said before with my metaphor, this means that we're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of energy thinking about how to systematically maybe present context, how to give good examples, if you wish, which is also, of course, also important. But we will focus a lot on this, while in understanding teaching as construction of knowledge, the emphasis is much more on how that knowledge will be understood, how it will be processed, how it will be developed. And here, of course, the focus is on how students think and how they will construct knowledge from what they hear. So again, these two very powerful metaphors. Yeah? So on the one hand, knowledge transfer, which can be imagined in very physical terms. So I have something which I give to you. And the metaphor of construction, yeah? So of building foundations. Yeah? This metaphor, of course, is an old friend in science, yeah? Of building, of construction. Yeah. Now, a very important implication of these two paradigms is that they also reflect the way students will learn. So it's not just the way we teach, but it also reflects the way students learn. So it influences the approaches to the way students learn. And in fact, we can talk about different ways of approaching teaching. Yeah. So also in research, we can see that the way we approach teaching falls into two broad groups. On the one hand, content or teacher-centered approaches, and on the other hand, learning or student-centered approaches, as we can see here. Yeah. Now, research has shown that there is a link between approaches to teaching and how teachers understand teaching. And again, there are two major ways of perceiving teaching. We can perceive or understand teaching as information transfer, as we just saw before, or teaching as learning facilitation. And the way teachers perceive teaching guides the way in which lessons will be delivered. This is an important, again, I'm saying it again and again, but it's a really important link. So for those of us for teachers who conceptualize teaching as information transfer, teaching will focus on the content and the teacher. Those who conceptualize teaching as promoting learning, the focus will be on teaching, on the student and her learning. Now, very importantly, these approaches also reflect the approaches to study. And again, research shows that a teacher adopt more surface approaches to learning without, let's say, a more deep and more in-depth understanding of the subject, while a more student-centered approach encourages students to adopt a more deep approach to learning, promoting knowledge with understanding, applicability, very important, sustainability of knowledge. Okay, so going back to my metaphors of teacher as encyclopedia or teacher as a gardener, where could I place them here? Closer to teaching as knowledge transfer or closer to teaching as knowledge construction? So this is a question. I think it's quite pretty clear at this point where, right? So teacher as a book, teacher as an encyclopedia, of course, would be closer to teaching as knowledge transfer, and teacher as gardener to knowledge construction. Now, I would like to encourage you also to think about the metaphors which you mentioned in your chat, in the chat. Yeah? Where would you place these metaphors on this continuum? Closer to teaching as knowledge transfer or knowledge construction? Maybe think a little bit about this. I have the metaphors here, and clearly some of you already mentioned gardening. I like one of you mentioned gardener of minds, planting knowledge. Perfect, yeah, it really goes with the idea of construction. Some of you mentioned how I really like the idea of a metaphor of the teacher as a bee, yeah? As a bee. And this is an interesting metaphor. And we could try now in our reflective process to think about why. What are the connections between teachers and bees? What do we do so that we can make sense of this role? Yeah? So I'm not going to say it to you, but I might maybe try to find some reasons, some connections myself. So what does a bee do which makes it similar to teaching? Yeah? The bees go around and collect and making honey, so make something. Yeah, maybe closer to the gardener. I might put the bee closer to here, but it's an important part of using metaphors as reflective tools is to make sense of the metaphor for yourself, not somebody else doing it for you. Yeah, that's an important thing. Microscope was another metaphor used. Yeah, the teacher as a microscope. So somebody who gives you depth, you go into things. I might actually think of using, for myself, I could say that I would use it more here. I would put it closer to knowledge transfer because the microscope gives me an idea of going into things, but I don't really think too much about the students. But maybe you can make another reasoning out of this. We can say, okay, but like a microscope, also the teacher goes into things, tries to make sure also for the students together we can look into the microscope and so on and so on. So all these metaphors can be explained to yourself by using as many connections as possible. Another popular metaphor, which was also mentioned by one of you, coach, trainer. And again, this metaphor can be seen very much on the knowledge transfer part, saying, okay, you as a coach have the knowledge and you transfer the knowledge to the students. Yeah? The coach is usually an authority, has this high hierarchical, let's say, background. But it can also, the coach can also be seen from a different dimension, somebody who is a motivator. So this is why all these metaphors just help us get somewhere, get to the idea of how we see ourselves as university teachers. And this is what I would really like you to try and imagine. So my metaphor is here. How can I make sense of this? Why did I think of this metaphor first? Yeah, and reflect on the process. There are other metaphors which I really like also here. So we have Lorax, Dr. Seuss's Lorax, yeah, somebody who really cares for the environment in this case, and who fights for environmental issues. An influencer is also a great metaphor, which can also be analyzed and seen from different perspectives. Again, how do you make sense of it? Is an influencer somebody who motivates, who gives ideas, or somebody who just passes on, transmits things? So this is why metaphors can be used in this context. Okay, so talking about the role of the teacher as the university teacher, and constructivist approaches and perhaps more traditional approaches, we can all see that they focus on the way we teach, but also especially on the way learners think and how we can assist learners to get to knowledge with understanding, not just knowledge, but knowledge with understanding. And talking about this, of course, we get to the principles of active learning and teaching methods which encourage active learning. Because as we know, even in the most interesting lecture, attention levels very naturally drop, very often also dramatically, after the first 20 minutes of the presentation. And I guess a similar thing is happening also here, perhaps. So making lectures as interactive as possible is crucial for achieving higher levels of attention. And very importantly, not just attention, but also retention. So attention and activity leads to retention. So what do we gain with active learning and teaching? This is the question now. So what do we gain with active learning and teaching? And what are the main principles of active learning? First of all, of course, we know that active learning promotes the development of students' cognitive and communication skills. So both. We also know from research that students gain a more in-depth kind of comprehension. Yeah? So a deeper level of comprehension and retention. The principles of active learning say that students should be active participants in the learning process. So they are not just observers, they are also actors. Again, see, we're using metaphors all the time to understand the process. And I'd like to stop and look at more closely at a model which was proposed by Kolb, and it's called the experiential learning cycle, which is focused on the idea of learning by doing, because it helps us to understand in what sense active learning is useful and is connected also to the roles we have as teachers. Yeah. Okay, so Kolb pointed out the importance of subjective experience in the learning process. And he made a distinction between experiential learning on the one hand and more abstract reasoning and theoretical knowledge on the other hand. He also stressed this dialectical nature of learning. His main idea was that if we want learning to be effective, to really effective, the student has to go from one stage to another, so to follow, to progress through a kind of cycle, which he also described, and it's a cycle of 4 stages. I have it here if you look at it. So as you can see, this is Kolb's learning cycle. And the student has to go to process through these cycles, first having a concrete experience of something, then followed by observation and reflection on that experience, which then leads to abstract conceptualization or the formation of abstract concepts. Yeah, this part we're talking about the analysis, and of course also generalizations, so making some conclusions, which are then used in active experimentation. So they're used to test a hypothesis in some future situations, and these very often, of course, result in new experiences. And of course, the learning process does not stop here, but as you can see from the model, it's a cyclical process. It's a cyclical journey, if you wish, another metaphor. So as the students gain more experience, they continue to reflect, conceptualize, experiment. So they may go over this process many times, not just once. So in different study fields, this concrete experience may mean asking students to experiment first, observe what happens, then make some conclusions, and then go over again and again through experimentation. So for Kolb, learning in this way works best when students are encouraged to be actors. So they have to be actors and also observers. So interacting and experiencing, but also applying these abstract reasoning and theoretical constructions and constructs to different issues. Maybe to give us some ideas how Kolb's learning cycle actually works. I think for every different discipline, area of research and teaching, we could find an example. But if I just give you an example from real life, everyday life, I think it's a really simplistic example, to be honest. Let's say we want to learn how to ride a bike. Imagine now listening to a lecture on how on how to ride a bike, and then going and riding a bike, or rather just going to getting a bike and trying to ride it. So we get concrete experience, trying to balance, trying to steer, and so on, of course, also failing if it's the first time, many times. But by getting this concrete experience, we're given the possibility to then observe what is a positive development, so what was good, so what happens if I steer too quickly, for example, what happens if I'm not very balanced, and so on, what happens when I try to pedal, and so on. So we reflect, and make some observations out of these reflections. And of course, the observations then are turned into some concepts. So we say, okay, when I do this, this happens. So this is a concept. Be careful how you steer. If you keep your hands very straight, this is going to happen. So we already managed to come to the abstract conceptualization stage. And then, of course, we experiment again. So we do it again and again and again until this process is done. So we can then ride a bike. So you see, this is what Kolb is stressing. We should first have this concrete experience and go through the cycle to be able to really grasp the concepts. And I think for each of our disciplines, we can find an idea like this. I can speak for our discipline. Anja and I are both foreign language teaching methodology, let's say, experts. We work in foreign language teaching methodology, and what we do in our lessons, we very often just throw students to carry out activities for themselves first, without giving them a lot of feedback first, or a lot of, let's say, input on how it should be done. And they start teaching, they see things don't work because students don't react in the right way, and so on. And so they make observations, and they start reflecting on these observations. What went wrong? What was okay? Now they conclude, they make some conclusions about this, and then they experiment again. So in our case, it works perfectly. So this concrete experience with teaching without first having all the background, all the theoretical principles first. We do, of course, a combination, but it's very important for us, for them, to give them the possibility to experiment and experience it for themselves and make sense of the conclusions and abstract concepts in their mind. This is very different from a, let's say, traditional university context in which students listen to the lecturer, copy the facts, and then learn pages of content by heart for the final evaluation. Right? It maybe did make sense in the past, but today, if you just imagine, that all these facts, the knowledge, perfect lectures are available online. So anytime the students can have access to all this knowledge, the knowledge transfer can be done anytime, all the time, through perfect presentations, illustrations, encyclopedias, ChatGPT. So it's all available. So it doesn't make sense anymore to do this knowledge transfer all the time. So as you can see, the traditional role really is very different today. And maybe to give us an idea what we mean by that, of course, doesn't mean that what we did in the past was all wrong. Not at all. So it's useful maybe at this point to look at the difference between more passive and more active forms of teaching and learning. I have here a few, of course, examples. And if we just look first at this traditional lecture, the traditional formal lecture, ex cathedra lecture, as we sometimes say, traditionally, of course, seen as a passive form of learning. A transfer of information context. But of course, this does not mean that all the lectures are passive. In fact, we know that some of the lectures can be very effective. Students' mental activity can be very high. So when we say active learning, of course, we don't just mean active learning physically, but also mentally, very important. And in good lectures, lecturers can stimulate and encourage students to think with perfect examples, for example, with questions. This is also active learning. Yeah? So an efficient way for stimulating students' active learning and maybe making the traditional lecture more efficient is today to make sure they come prepared, and this is possible today. So they can actively engage in discussions, take notes. So imagine, for example, distributing lecture materials to the students before the lectures, allowing them really to be well prepared for the lectures. They will be able to follow with greater interest because they already know the topic to some extent. Yeah? And then they can also ask more relevant questions. So there's a principle of the flipped classroom here. Yeah? I do this quite a lot, I have to say, in my teaching, if I can share this with you. I ask students to prepare in advance, actually require them to do so. And if they are required to do so, they come to the lecture when there's a lecture format planned. They come, and if they already know things, then we can talk, then we can discuss. Their questions are much better in this way. And I also, from their feedback, I can see that they really like that. It's also true that sometimes we have to require it. It's not enough to just say, can you please read the materials before you come to the lessons? I think we all have this experience. I used to do this before, and few students read the materials. Today I say, okay, this is a requirement. You have to do it before you come to the lesson. You have to send me the questions, 2 questions, 2 relevant questions. And then, of course, the learning is much more relevant for them. Yeah, they understand better. So even a traditional formal lecture does not have to be passive. Yeah? It can be actually very active, especially if it's prepared in this flipped learning or a flipped classroom format. Reading materials, yeah, usually considered more passive than active. Yeah, so when we teach, we also require students to read. But again, also this can be done more actively. Yeah, as I mentioned before, one way of making reading an active form of learning is to give students maybe the instructions to read the material and then formulate 2 questions. Very important here, of course, is to go with the students through the process of asking good questions. And I think if we do it again in this organized, structured way, then reading can be made really active, because asking questions is really very hard, as we will also see later in the second part when Anja talks about asking good questions. Yeah? So asking good questions is hard, but if we use this process of asking questions also as a strategy for making reading more active, it can work really to our advantage. Then we have demonstration, of course. So usually, again, it's more seen as a passive teaching method, but of course, it can also be encouraged. We can also encourage students to demonstrate for themselves. Yeah? So they do the demonstration, and also this can be an active method. Yeah, a discussion would usually be considered the first really active teaching method. Yeah? So an active form of work. Collaborative learning comes to mind here. Discussions, of course, we know encourage thinking, participation, active involvement. Today, discussions don't need to take place in classrooms, in lecture halls. Study groups, e-learning forums can be used today for encouraging discussions. So really, really, really important also as a competence. Teamwork is a competence we, I think, all have in our curricula. So teamwork today is really, can be done in so many different ways that there's no excuse for us not to include it in our teaching. Then we have, of course, learning by doing, making learning more personal, more meaningful. Very important that learning by doing encourages better retention, better recall of the material studied. It also enables storing what is learned in long-term memory. Very important this. So including also active learning by doing in our teaching makes a lot of sense. And perhaps also I would like to mention one teaching method which is considered the most active. So I started with more passive teaching methods and going to the last, the most important one. But of course, as we saw, it doesn't mean that some of them are passive. Yeah? So formal lectures, reading, and so on can also be made really active through using different strategies. So the last one, the most active method is teaching others. The most active form of learning, the most intense. It allows for long-term retention, deeper understanding. Here we are talking about mostly peer teaching, of course. When one student teaches another, it is very important here, of course, for the teacher to guide, direct the learning process. Of course, also the choice of topic is important, the preparation is important, what kind of texts we can use for peer teaching. So this is really very important. It doesn't mean that we're going to just give students articles to read and then teach each other. We have to prepare the material really carefully. Not everything, of course, can be taught in this way, but it is a very efficient form of learning. And imagine, I give you now something to teach to each other. Just imagine the idea, something that you are not familiar with. I'm giving you some materials, now study them and then teach somebody else. It's really, really very intense. It takes a lot of responsibility, yeah, on the part of the person who will then teach. So here we have a number of different combinations which we can see from the different passive and active teaching methods. All of them are good, and using all of them really makes sense. It's for certain goals. Yeah? But I would really like to encourage you and think about also this idea of teaching others. And maybe just if I mention what one of the big names, let's say, in teaching methods and learning theories has said, and this is of course the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, he said, the one who does the talking does the learning. In this way, pointing to the fact that by teaching others, we really take responsibility for teaching, and the teaching is very intense. So, what is the best form of teaching, let's say? What is the best way to teach if we try to now take some conclusions from what we have just discussed? First, of course, we have to always consider the different teaching styles. Yeah? We have, professors have, and also students. So some of us can be really good in giving lectures, and in this way also engaging students actively, their active thinking. And this is, of course, active learning as well, as we said. Others prefer to use more participatory methods, encouraging students to take responsibility for their learning. Now, I think it really makes sense to be aware of the advantages of all these methods and then use them in combination. Depending on the learning situation, the complexity of material is also very important. So, especially now in the last years, we have been really talking a lot about using methods such as role plays, simulations, project work, problem-based learning, let's say, and at the university level, especially inquiry-based learning. Yeah. Inquiry-based learning has been proposed as a really effective learning method. So, what do we understand by inquiry-based learning? First of all, inquiry-based learning is an example of active learning. We know this already. It's student-centered. It promotes critical thinking. It encourages students to solve real-world problems, real-world scenarios to solve. Yeah? So they must apply their knowledge and skills to find some solutions Yeah, and in this way, of course, also encouraging problem-solving abilities. It's very important also to say that inquiry-based learning requires active participation from all students. So hands-on activities, experiments, discussions, all these kinds of forms of study are encouraged. This also means that they collaborate in groups, they share ideas, they brainstorm, they together collaboratively investigate some complex questions or problems. And one more thing maybe to say is that students are also encouraged to reflect on their learning experience. So very important to develop learning strategies and also encourage students to reflect on how much they have learned, how they can apply this knowledge. Yeah. So these are the main principles, let's say, of inquiry-based learning. But the question for us is, where is the teacher? Where is the teacher? What role does the teacher play in this inquiry-based learning? And also other student-centered, let's say, approaches. Yeah? So where is the teacher? This is the question. Yeah, where is the teacher? Yeah, there are three important questions to answer. Yeah? Three important questions, and I'm going to start with the first one. Yeah? So first of all, the teacher, of course, we can say is a facilitator. Yeah? I think this is clear from the beginning. Yeah? Inquiry-based learning requires a facilitator as a teacher. And of course, we mentioned this before, but the word facilitator comes from the Latin word facilitare. Yeah? So make something easy. In other words, we help students by directing and supporting them. So how much direction is the question? Yeah, first, how much direction? Is it the teacher who decides what students do? What questions, what problems should be investigated? Or are the students left to take the decisions about what to study for themselves? Yeah? So how much direction should the teacher offer? So is this inquiry more teachers directed or more student directed? So this is one of the important questions in inquiry-based learning. Then the next question is, how much scaffolding? So how much support? Scaffolding, of course, means support. Yeah, should be provided. Yeah, scaffolding is an interesting metaphor again, and it also gives us the idea that this support should be at a certain point taken away, so that the students can do something independently. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that providing more support and guidance at the start is a good idea, but then gradually we have to take this support away so that the students can do it independently for themselves. For example, maybe the teacher can help the students to formulate the research questions or problems at the beginning, giving them maybe support with the methodology, suggesting them the methodology to be used, but then in later stages, slowly taking away the support and maybe just answer questions, not giving them these ideas anymore. And again, with more advanced students at the master level, PhD level, of course, scaffolding can be very little already at the beginning. And I think we already know this. If you look at maybe undergraduates and then graduate students, this is what we do. And this is also related to the type of inquiry, which can be more structured. For example, teachers give the students the problem already, or suggest the problem, and also the procedures, how to solve the problem. It can be more guided, when the teachers guide the students in their research, or maybe it can be more an open inquiry. So the students work mostly by themselves throughout the process. Again, what usually doctoral students do. So to wind up the topic of teacher role, yeah, we've said a lot about the teacher role, but we can say that in teacher-centered learning, the teacher is the primary focus, with students watching, maybe listening, paying attention, as teachers explain, give examples. In student-centered learning, the teacher still plays, of course, a very important role, but it's not at the center of attention.
As my colleague Silva already explained, we're going to talk about questions. We started talking about active learning methods, and Silva said that the next topic is asking questions. So questions is very much part of an element in almost all of what we do. We know that asking questions is basically at the core of our work as teachers and researchers. Today we're focusing on our role as teachers. Ash says that teachers are professional question makers. So we know that questions is one of our basic tools for stimulating student learning and thinking. So it is important that we know or recognize the aim of our questions, that we hopefully ask the right questions in the right way. But before we start with this, can you see my slide? Okay. So first, I would like, thank you. First, I would like you to think of reasons for your question making and you asking questions in the lecture hall. So what is your aim? Why do you ask questions in the lecture hall? And if you can just write a few maybe aims in chat. I'll just stop sharing. Great. So yeah, we typically ask, we say, yeah, I ask my students questions to check understanding. Some of you mentioned previous knowledge, checking if they understand or maybe checking if they understand the relevance of the topic, right? You also mentioned critical thinking. Yeah, we ask questions to develop their critical thinking, which is, of course, one of the aims in all of our syllabi. But also to structure the content, right? With checking the previous knowledge is also part of that, right? So moving the lesson forward. We of course ask questions to manage our classes. We try to use the questions to encourage cooperation, to guide our students. Maybe also point out certain things, as you already said, the relevance of the topic, for example. This was also mentioned, right? Raising motivation, their interest, their curiosity, and getting their attention. And also get an insight into their ways of thinking. So how is it that they build their knowledge, build their understanding? Yeah. What are the reasons for the difficulties that they encounter? Why is it that they make these particular mistakes? Yeah, we can also use questions for that. And last but not least, and some of you also mentioned this, to build relationships. Yeah, so we use questions to build relationships with our students. Now, this role of dialogue in teaching was emphasized already in the dialogical approach used by Socrates. We know that he used the dialogue as a learning method, active learning method, yeah, helping the students to construct their knowledge. So what he did was, by asking students, he really drew their attention to the inconsistencies in their thinking, constantly making sure that he was guiding them towards knowledge and not transmitting knowledge himself. And we know that in this way he dramatically changed the power relations. And I think that we are very often not aware of the social function of questions, or not aware of this function enough, right? So that besides the cognitive, they also have the social function. Bamford, for example, emphasizes this social aspect. And he says it's important to understand lectures not as monologues, not as one-way transmission of information, but a conversation between two participants. And if you think about it, lectures, participatory lectures, that we all wish to design and then give to our students, actually have a lot of characteristics of a conversation. Now, of course, we also know that the, let's say, conversation, a lecture in a lecture hall is very different from a conversation that we might have outside the classroom. And that is because we have a specific pedagogic motive, that is to establish the so-called learning space. In the lecture hall, we're trying to structure the learning experience for our students and direct them their attention to various aspects of the subject matter. And we have a lot of studies that show that questions are a means of building and also sustaining relationships with our students. So the way to create contact with the students, to establish relationship and then sustain this relationship. Why am I stressing this? Because it is in this way that we can then create an environment that encourages participation and active learning. Yeah? So creating a relationship with the students is crucial for that. It is almost impossible to do it without this relationship. I noticed, initially Silva Bratož asked you for to tell us where is it that you're coming from and which study field or which discipline. And I know that we have a very diverse group here today. So, and we also know that the student participation can depend also on the scientific field of the student study program. Cheng points out that lectures in humanities and in social sciences use questions and also other participant or interaction prompts more frequently than lectures in natural sciences. Why? Well, we know that the nature of knowledge in social sciences and humanities is different. It is typically more open, allows various interpretations, different perspectives, and this can make, or it's easier to make, the learning process more dialogical, more student-centered. So this is definitely something to consider. And another thing worth mentioning here is one of the prompting strategies that is called cold calling. This is basically when we encourage students who do not volunteer to answer to respond. So I don't know how it is at your faculties, but in Slovenia, the widespread practice is for students who know the answer or who would like to answer to raise their hands, and these are typically the students that we then ask. We know that this is a widespread practice, and we also know that it is often inefficient. Why? It encourages the participation of only some students. Very often what happens is that we get a group of dominant students who always participate and those who never participate. Of course, and it is my understanding of that is that lectures typically don't want to embarrass the students. They don't want to cause any anxiety, and this is why they only ask those who volunteer. But a study conducted by Dallimore and his associates in 2013 showed, to me this was quite a surprise, that in the learning environments where this cold calling was an established practice, so this was almost as a routine, so something that simply was done, what happened is that more students voluntarily engaged in discussions, and not only that, but also they asked more questions and gave more answers. So cold calling, surprisingly, only, of course, when established as a practice, actually promoted participation and encouraged student engagement. At this point, I would ask you again to participate by really going through a short survey, only 4 questions at Mentimeter. We actually conducted a survey in which we asked our students very similar questions. Now, this survey was conducted by Silva and myself in 2020, and the participants were 252 students from various study programs at our university. The study was on the attitudes towards questions posed by lecturers, so the attitudes of students towards lectures that are posed by their lecturers. And what I can say is that students really showed that they're well aware of the importance of questions in the pedagogical process. I did not expect them to really think about that particular aspect of the pedagogical process, but they did. And they very much stress that good questions, in their opinion, are those who which promote collaboration between students. So they said, if I quote them, questions that activate students, questions that can develop into a more in-depth conversation on the topic, that encourage students to express their own opinions and views on the topic, questions that turn into discussions, questions when there is not just one correct answer, and that stimulate debates. For me, this indicates that they are aware of the importance of questions in creating or shaping the learning space. Yeah, so the learning space in which they feel safe and encouraged to express their viewpoints, to maybe also confront different perspectives. So in the creation of this safe and encouraging learning space. The students then also said that they were quite, or they expressed quite positive attitudes towards learning environments in which a range of questions were asked. So where really this was a prompting strategy that was very often used by the lecturer, and they expressed positive attitudes towards professors who frequently ask questions. But of course, the right questions in the right way. So they were also critical towards pointless questions that were maybe too simplistic, inappropriately formulated questions that, I don't know, were posed in such a way that it seemed that the professor is not really interested in the answer. And also professors who were not good at asking questions, asking the same students, interrupting the answer, expecting only one a specific answer, and so on. So what kind of questions do you mostly ask during lectures? I'm really glad to see that the vast majority of those of you who answered ask open-ended questions, because these are exactly the types of questions that our students perceive as those who lead to discussions. They reported that they are very often asked close-ended questions, closed questions that seem to have only one correct answer, that then do not stimulate debates, and that they're very often then, if they're not absolutely certain in their answer, they do not feel like answering. Yeah. So then next question. Are your questions always answered by more or less the same students? So what I would like to finish with this talking about this study is that the students really pointed to the importance of a student-friendly learning environment for responding to questions. So I'm willing to participate, to respond to my professor's questions if I feel that I'm in a safe learning environment. Now, in that regard, let me just stress again that peer pressure was seen as the the crucial component. So positive interaction not only between the student and professor, but also between peers. But of course, so this is one aspect. So asking questions for their social function. So to establish the relationship, to then create this learning space and to encourage participation. But of course, we know that we predominantly ask questions to get feedback for the students and to see how well they understand the subject matter and also how they construct their knowledge. So in this regard, it's really crucial to ask questions in such a way that they really stimulate cognitive processes on different levels. So higher order thinking skills. One of the most frequently used taxonomies, I think, so frameworks that classify questions by looking at these cognitive processes, is Bloom's taxonomy. You're probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. It was first developed in the 1950s by Benjamin Bloom and his associates. And it was then in 2001 revised by a group of scientists. And this is the version that we're using nowadays. And so we can see from the picture that this taxonomy divides the cognitive processes into 6 levels. So from less to more demanding. So from less demanding, remembering, understanding, applying, to more demanding, that of analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Now, on the level of remembering, students simply retrieve information from long-term memory, usually in the same form as they were learned. When we come to understanding, they need to not just retrieve the information, but also construct meaning, interpreting this information. Then at the level of application, they select the information, they learned and they use them to complete a task, to solve a problem. So they apply. Then it's analyzing, where students break the material into, let's say, foundational parts and determine the relationship between these parts, how they relate to one another, and also to the overall structure. Then they evaluate. So when evaluating, they have to, of course, use specific criteria and standards to make judgments. And finally, the highest of them all, creating. Students then put these elements and ideas together to form something completely new, a new product, a new proposal. Yeah. Okay, let you give you examples of questions according to Bloom's taxonomy for this particular topic, and we can see if you thought of similar questions or tasks, or if you maybe have some examples that you think are worth sharing with us after I present these examples that I created with my colleague, because this really is not my field. So for the remembering, so this lowest for the thinking skills, students need to recall the definition, right? What is mass tourism? I remember the definition, and typically they simply produce the definition as they learned it. Then for the level of understanding, describe a specific example of mass tourism. Now, they need to show that they understand this concept and the characteristics of this concept, and use it to describe a specific example. Then application, look at the picture and explain if it fits the definition. Yes, could be this particular photo that I'm using on this slide. They use their knowledge of mass tourism in a new context, right? Something new, but they need to use the knowledge to explain. Analyzing why cannot mass tourism develop in protected areas? Now here, they need to understand the characteristics of mass tourism and those of protected areas, and establish how they relate to one another, right? So why is it that mass tourism is not compatible with protected areas? Then the level of evaluating. Based on tourism development trend, explain whether Ljubljana is becoming or has already become a mass tourism destination. So students need to evaluate a destination based on a specific criteria. And that is mass tourism, tourism development trends. And the topmost, is design a tourist product in such a way that you avoid the negative effects of mass tourism. Of course, we can see that higher order thinking skills include lower order thinking skills, right? So we don't have to every single time pose the whole series of questions, but we understand that when we ask students to analyze, they will also show understanding. When we ask them to evaluate, they need to apply also analyzing to do that. Did you maybe think of other questions that you think are good examples of any of these levels for mass tourism? Another thing that I would like to ask to consider when posing questions is whether questions are open enough to foster discussion. Now, in the survey, the majority of you said, yes, I ask open-ended questions, which I think is great. And you'll remember that in our survey, in our study, students also identified those questions that foster discussion, those questions that turn into debates as the questions that really encourage their participation. So are they open enough, or are our questions open enough to foster discussions? Another, I think, familiar topic that we all encounter in our everyday life is that of recycling. Do you separate waste? Now, this question, of course, can be perceived as rather simplistic. Yeah? So obvious is the answer that it doesn't really deserve a response, right? So I can just picture my students looking at me and thinking, I'm not going to answer this question. It is too simplistic. It is closed. It is not worth answering. But of course, we can simply modify it in such a way that we then do foster a discussion, activate more demanding cognitive processes. For example, we could ask simply, why do we separate waste? Or if you were asked to design a poster about separating waste for your town, what would you focus on? So we can immediately see that a diversity of, let's say, these cognitive processes would be used to answer this question. Or how would we encourage people to separate waste in the municipality of Koper? This is the municipality in which University of Primorska is located. To maybe just wrap up and look again at the strategies for asking questions. It's very important to create a question-friendly environment. So you remember that I mentioned that our role in the lectures is also to minimize competitiveness and really minimize peer pressure, if we can, of course. But we can do it by not, let's say, encouraging the same students, by asking only those who always volunteer to maybe start almost unconsciously ignoring the students that might be more passive or might be not brave enough to participate in discussions. Part of that, so creating a question-friendly environment, is also so not just students answering our questions or responding to our questions, but also students asking questions. Avoid questions with obvious answers. You'll probably remember the question, do you separate waste? Which I said is so simplistic, so obvious that students do not feel, I don't know, they simply don't answer. It's not challenging enough, right? Of course, we often use use rhetorical questions that have a different function, that move the lesson forward, right? But we should be aware of our aim, right? So if we ask, or if we expect students to answer, then the answer shouldn't be too obvious. On the other hand, it can be quite tricky also asking complex questions, right? So we might consider breaking those complex questions down into more manageable sub-questions. And you remember the think, pair, share technique. So giving the students then the answer and the structure to actually answer these complex questions. Ask one question at a time. Now, this might be, I don't know, seen as something so obvious and so self-evident, but it might, in my experience, it is not, or it is quite often that lecturers simply ask a series of questions. Sometimes the idea is, I'm giving them sub-questions that just to encourage the answer, but it can be confusing for the students. Ask different questions and questions that foster discussion. So we should really think of questions that encourage different cognitive processes or stimulate these really high order thinking skills, and open-ended questions or questions that foster discussion to then get the students to participate. And we know that it is not that easy to ask such questions, so it might be a good idea to plan them ahead, especially those which we identify as really important for construction of knowledge, for guiding the students in the right direction, right? Of course, not every single question in our lectures needs to be planned, but those that we see as quite important for this construction of knowledge are avoid addressing your questions to the same students. This can easily happen, and I think that we should be conscious of that and avoiding that, because as we already established, this very often results in dominant group and the passive group and the exclusion of some students from this conversation that is the participatory lecture. Do not interrupt students while they're answering your questions. So this was another thing that was mentioned in our study by the students. They said, I do not participate, I do not answer the questions of those lecturers who interrupt me as I'm trying to answer, because clearly what they are telling me is that they're not really interested in my answer, but that they have a specific answer in mind, and if they see that I'm not going in that direction, they're not interested anymore. And if students don't answer your question, do not answer it yourself. Sometimes we feel a little bit frustrated. Maybe we think that the pace is too slow, that the lecture should really move on, and we simply answer the question ourselves. But it's much more effective if we reformulate the question. For example, if I ask the question, what is anxiety? And I don't get the answer, if I then reformulate it and I say something like, how does an anxious person behave? This might be a question that is more easily understood and then answered. Thank you for spending this Friday morning with Professor Silva Bratož and myself. And have a lovely Friday.